In a small town, nestled amid fields and rivers, lived a man named Mark. Mark was a rugged, middle-aged contractor, a white man with calloused hands and a face weathered by years of hard work under the sun. He was well known around town for his skills in construction. But when it came to family, Mark was alone. His days were simple, dedicated to his craft and the occasional company of his neighbors. He had never considered fatherhood, never imagined what it might feel like to have a family of his own. Then, one day, the town was struck by tragic news. A young couple, beloved by many, had lost their lives in a terrible accident, leaving behind their 3 sons, Tom, Ben, and Leo. The boys, ages 12, 9, and 6, had no close relatives willing to take them in. They were alone, lost in the world, and the townsfolk, sympathetic as they were hesitant to step forward. But Mark, who'd seen the boys around town, felt something shift deep within him. He couldn't explain it, but every time he thought about them, he felt a pull, a responsibility. He'd never been a father, yet he was sure he had to do something. After long, sleepless nights, Mark made up his mind. He walked into the town's adoption office and declared his decision. "I'll take them," he said, his voice steady but his heart pounding. Word spread quickly. People whispered and raised eyebrows, questioning Mark's choice. Why would he adopt 3 black children, some sneered, their prejudice unmasked by their shock? "They're so different from him," others said, as if skin color could dictate the bond of a family. What does a single, middle-aged man know about raising kids anyway? But Mark brushed off the gossip like sawdust on his old work boots. He was determined. This was about giving 3 boys a home, about filling their lives with love and security. They'd already lost everything. He couldn't bear to see them left adrift. To him, it was that simple. On the day he brought Tom, Ben, and Leo home, his house felt different. It was no longer just 4 walls and a roof. It was alive, filled with laughter, shouts, and the occasional burst of tears. The boys were nervous, unsure of what to expect, and so was Mark. But he took their hands, knelt down, and looked into their eyes with all the sincerity he could muster. "I'm not perfect," he told them. "I've never done this before, but I promise you, I'll always be here. This is your home now, and no one will take that from you." In that moment, he saw something change in their eyes, a glimmer of trust, a flicker of hope. The pickup truck came to a gentle stop in front of a modest 2-story house with white paint faded from years of sun and rain. Mark's hands gripped the steering wheel for a moment, steadying himself before turning to look back at the 3 boys in the back seat. Their faces were a mix of nervousness and uncertainty, clutching their small backpacks with white knuckles and wide, cautious eyes that darted between each other and the unfamiliar surroundings. This was it, the beginning of something new for all of them. Mark took a deep breath, trying to steady his voice, to find the right words that might ease their worries. "Well, boys," he said gently, "this is home." For a moment, the word home seemed to hover in the air, weighted with the promise of safety and comfort, yet tinged with the uncertainty that comes with something so unfamiliar. The boys looked at each other, processing the word with hesitation. Tom, the oldest at 12, studied the house thoughtfully. His face held a flicker of hope, but his jaw was set with the resilience he'd needed to take care of his brothers after their parents' death. Ben, the 9-year-old, leaned in closer to Tom, his face filled with a childlike curiosity, tempered by doubt. And little Leo, just 6, held onto his brother's arm tightly, his eyes peering out from behind him with a mix of fear and awe. Mark climbed out of the truck, opened the back door, and held out his hand. "Come on, let's go inside," he encouraged, his voice warm. They moved slowly, almost hesitantly, stepping onto the concrete path that led to the front door. The house may not have been grand, but it was Mark's pride. He had worked on it himself over the years, fixing up the worn edges, reinforcing the roof, and making sure the bones of the house were strong and steady, just like the promise he wanted to make to these boys. He unlocked the front door and swung it open, standing aside to let them enter first. They hesitated at the threshold, as if they were crossing into an unknown world. "It's okay," he said softly, trying to meet their eyes with reassurance. One by one, they stepped in, their footsteps echoing in the quiet room. The interior was simple but cozy, soft brown couches, a well-worn rug, and shelves filled with books and trinkets from Mark's years of travel and work. Sunlight filtered through the windows, casting a warm glow on the room, as if the house itself was trying to offer a gentle welcome. "Come on, I'll show you around," Mark said, leading them through the house. He pointed out the kitchen with its inviting aroma of fresh coffee, the small backyard where an old swing creaked gently in the breeze, and finally, he led them up a narrow staircase to the bedrooms. He opened the door to a room painted a cheerful shade of blue, with 3 beds, each made up with freshly washed sheets and a small chest at the foot of each bed. "This will be your room," he said, his voice just above a whisper. "I know it's a little plain right now, but we can fix that. You can make it yours, however you want." The boys stood in silence, taking it all in. Ben broke the quiet, looking up at Mark with an uncertain smile. "It's big," he said, almost as if speaking to himself. Mark chuckled, a warm, comforting sound that filled the room. "Big enough for all 3 of you," he said, ruffling Ben's hair lightly, sensing a small victory in the boy's budding smile. As they made their way back to the living room, Mark noticed how they kept close together, still a little unsure, still holding on to the familiar comfort of each other. He turned to face them, kneeling down so he could meet their eyes. There was so much he wanted to say, but he kept it simple, wanting his words to resonate with a sense of promise. "Listen, boys," he began, his voice steady and calm. "I know this is all new, and probably a little scary. You don't know me well, and I'm not perfect." He paused, glancing at each of them. "But I want you to understand something very important. This isn't temporary. This is your home now, and I'm going to be here for you, always. We're a family now, and families stick together, no matter what." A heavy silence followed his words, the kind that meant they were truly sinking in. Leo's small hand tightened around his brother's sleeve, and his lower lip trembled slightly. "Promise?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Mark's heart ached at the vulnerability in the youngest boy's voice. He reached out, putting a gentle hand on Leo's shoulder. "I promise," he replied firmly, his voice thick with emotion. "I promise, Leo." As they stood there in the quiet of their new home, something shifted. The doubts, the whispers of those in town who didn't understand, all faded into the background. In that moment, the house felt like it had breathed in new life, its walls warm with the promise of a family born not from blood, but from a shared commitment to face the future together. Mark stood up, his eyes shining with pride and a sense of responsibility. He wasn't sure what lay ahead. He knew there would be challenges, moments of doubt, and perhaps even times when the boys questioned their place here. But he also knew, deep down, that they would be all right, as long as they held on to the promise they'd made today. "All right," he said, his voice lighter, almost playful. "Who's up for some mac and cheese?" The boys exchanged glances, and finally, a small smile broke through on Tom's face, followed by a tentative nod from Ben. Leo giggled, a sound so soft and sweet that it lifted Mark's heart. They filed into the kitchen, a little more relaxed, a little more at ease. As Mark began to boil the water, the boys settled at the kitchen table, glancing around, occasionally looking at Mark with something that felt like trust. He caught their gaze and gave a reassuring smile, feeling, for the first time, that they were starting to believe they had finally found a place to call home. And as the smell of their first meal together filled the air, Mark felt that maybe, just maybe, he was the father they needed after all. The sense of peace that Mark and the boys had begun to carve out in their new life was short-lived as the small town's whispers quickly turned into pointed looks and hostile murmurs. At first, it was just a stray comment here or there, a suspicious glance, a muttered remark under someone's breath. Mark tried to brush it off, hoping it was just small-town chatter that would fade with time. But the more he went out with the boys, the more palpable the tension became. The first real confrontation came at the grocery store. Mark was browsing the aisles with Tom, Ben, and Leo, each of them holding on to the side of the cart, eager to help him choose ingredients for dinner. As they wandered down the cereal aisle, Mark noticed an older woman giving them a long, hard stare, her lips pursed tightly, her gaze cold and disapproving. He could feel the boys tense beside him, and Tom shifted his body slightly, instinctively positioning himself between his brothers and the woman, his protective instinct kicking in. Mark decided to ignore her, hoping that simply going about their shopping would be enough to diffuse the situation. But as he reached for a box of cereal, the woman scoffed loudly, crossing her arms as she looked at him with thinly veiled contempt. "Some things just don't belong here," she muttered, loud enough for them all to hear. Mark froze, feeling the heat rise in his cheeks, but he didn't let go of the cereal box. He turned to look at her, holding her gaze firmly but refusing to escalate the situation. "Excuse me?" he asked, his voice calm but laced with a quiet strength. The woman didn't flinch. "You heard me," she replied, her tone dripping with disdain. "This is a respectable town. People here don't mix like that." She looked down at the boys, her gaze sharp, and muttered, "Poor kids, dragged into something they don't even understand." The boys lowered their heads, visibly shrinking under her harsh scrutiny. Ben's fingers clung tightly to Mark's sleeve, his eyes darting away in shame. Mark clenched his jaw, feeling an ache in his chest as he looked down at them. These were just children, innocent and deserving of love. How could anyone not see that? He knelt down to their level, his voice gentle as he spoke only to them. "Hey, don't listen to her," he said softly. "You have every right to be here. We're a family, and nothing anyone says can change that." Tom's eyes filled with gratitude and resolve, but Ben and Leo still looked away, their small shoulders hunched as if they wanted to disappear. Mark stood back up, giving the woman one last hard look. Without another word, he guided the boys to another aisle, trying to shelter them from the negativity that seemed to follow them. The encounters didn't stop there. At the diner, where he'd once been a regular, familiar faces suddenly grew cold. When he walked in with the boys, he noticed people turning away, whispering behind their hands, even going quiet until he sat down. He could hear the occasional insult, the sharp edge of disapproval hanging in the air. When they'd tried to order, a server had sighed and tapped her foot impatiently, barely giving the boys a second glance before hurrying away as if she couldn't wait to leave. One afternoon, while they were out walking to the park, a man who had once been a friendly face in town stopped Mark on the sidewalk, blocking their path. "Mark," he said, forcing a smile that didn't reach his eyes, "I'm just curious. Why'd you go and do something like this?" Mark's face remained impassive, but his tone was firm. "Because they needed a family, and I'm happy to be that for them." The man shook his head, a mocking smile twisting his lips. "Look, Mark, I know you mean well, but this just isn't normal. It's not what people are used to seeing around here. You're making things complicated, for you and for them." Mark felt anger stir in his chest, but he held it back. His priority focused on protecting the boys from hearing too much. He bent down, meeting their eyes with a reassuring look. "Why don't you go on ahead to the swings?" he said softly, trying to give them a moment away from the harshness. The boys nodded, Tom leading the way, glancing back over his shoulder protectively, as if still not fully trusting that Mark was safe. Once the boys were out of earshot, Mark straightened, his gaze meeting the man's. "You're right about one thing," he said, his voice low but unwavering. "They didn't choose this. They didn't choose to lose their parents, to be alone in the world. But I chose to be there for them, and I'm not going anywhere, no matter what anyone says." The man gave him a hard look before muttering, "Suit yourself," and walked away. Mark watched him go, feeling the weight of the town's judgment press down on him. But he reminded himself of the promise he'd made to the boys, to be the family they needed. When he joined the boys at the swings, he could see Tom's face was tight with frustration, his jaw clenched as he stared out at the park. Ben and Leo seemed subdued, and even their laughter felt hollow, edged with a sadness they couldn't quite shake. That night, as they sat around the dinner table, the boys were unusually quiet, picking at their food. Finally, Tom broke the silence, his voice filled with a mix of sadness and defiance. "Why don't they like us, Mark?" he asked, looking up with eyes that held both a yearning for answers and a flicker of pain. Mark set down his fork, his heart heavy as he looked at the boys. He knew he couldn't shield them from the truth, no matter how much he wanted to protect them. "Sometimes people are afraid of things they don't understand," he said gently. "They might say things that aren't fair, or they might act in ways that don't make sense. But that doesn't mean there's anything wrong with us, with our family. What matters is that we're here for each other, that we're kind and strong." Ben looked down, his small hands clenching around his napkin, and whispered, "But it hurts. It feels like we're different, like we don't belong. Mark reached out, resting a comforting hand on Ben's shoulder. I know, buddy. I know it hurts. But I promise you, one day, those people will see that we're just as much a family as any other. And until then, I'll be here for you every step of the way. Leo looked up at him, his eyes shining with a mixture of hope and vulnerability. You promise, Mark? I promise, Mark said, his voice filled with the quiet strength of a vow that could not be broken. No matter what anyone else says, we're family, and that's something they can never take away from us. In the days that followed, they went out together, shoulders squared and heads held high, a silent defiance in the way they stuck close to each other, refusing to let the judgment of others tear them apart. With each cold stare and whispered insult, their bond only grew stronger, a quiet resilience forming between them. And though the road was rough, each night they sat together around that dinner table, laughing, talking, sharing their dreams, knowing that here, in the warmth of their little home, they belonged. As the days passed and the weight of the community's disapproval became something they all learned to carry together, Mark sought out ways to create special moments of joy and closeness for his new family. He knew he couldn't change the town's hearts overnight, but he could help build up his son's spirits, strengthen their confidence, and create a world of warmth and trust within their home. One evening, after dinner, Mark glanced over at the boys and saw the lingering sadness in their eyes, a kind of restless energy that came from all the pent-up feelings of the past few weeks. He knew just what might help to lift their spirits. Clearing his throat, he looked around the table with a small smile. How'd you boys feel about a little adventure? He asked, raising an eyebrow. Leo's face lit up immediately, his eyes wide with curiosity. An adventure? Where to? Mark chuckled. Right here, he said, nodding towards the back door. There's something I'd like to share with you all, something I think you'll enjoy. He stood and led them out to the garage, flicking on the light to reveal his humble woodworking setup. A collection of sturdy wooden tables, tools, and shelves filled with wood pieces, some roughly cut and others carefully carved and sanded. Tom's eyes widened as he looked around, taking in the chisels, planes, and wooden planks with fascination. Wow, you made all this stuff? He asked, tracing a finger along a polished tabletop that gleamed under the light. Mark nodded proudly. I've been at it for years. I've always loved working with my hands, shaping things, making something useful or beautiful from nothing more than a piece of wood. It's a bit of an escape for me, a place where things make sense, where patience and hard work can turn something raw into something special. Ben looked at a carved wooden eagle on one of the shelves, its wings stretched wide, capturing a sense of freedom in its stillness. Did you make this too? He asked, awe in his voice. That one took me a while, Mark said, smiling as he watched Ben's fingers gently trace the eagle's feathers. It took time and a lot of mistakes, but that's part of the process. And that's what I want to share with you boys, if you're up for it. Tom looked at him, his expression filled with determination. We're up for it. What can we do? Mark chuckled and clapped his hands together. Well then, let's start with the basics. He pulled out a set of small sanded blocks and handed each of them a piece, along with a small plane. The first thing we learn is patience. Just like anything worthwhile, woodworking takes time. Your job now is to sand these blocks down until they're smooth. The boys set to work, their faces a mix of concentration and excitement. The rhythmic sound of sandpaper on wood filled the garage as they focused on their tasks. Mark moved around, offering gentle guidance, showing them how to hold the tools, how to watch the grain of the wood. For the first time in days, their worries seemed to fade, replaced by a calm, steady sense of purpose. As they worked, Mark shared stories of his own learning experiences. He told them of the early days when he'd nicked his hands or accidentally splintered a piece, only to keep going until he got it right. The boys listened intently, laughing at his missteps, reassured by the thought that even their strong, capable father had once struggled too. Leo, with his tongue sticking out in focus, was the first to hold up his block. Look, Mark, it's so smooth now, he beamed, pride radiating from his small face. Mark inspected it, nodding with approval. Nicely done, Leo. That's the result of your hard work. And you know what? That's something no one can take away from you. You put in the time, you kept going even when it was tough, and now you have something to show for it. Gradually, Mark introduced them to more complex tasks. He taught Tom how to carve simple patterns, showing him how to hold the chisel and guide it with care. Tom's focus was fierce, his hands steady as he etched small designs, building his confidence with each line. For Ben, who seemed more hesitant, Mark showed him how to assemble pieces, guiding him step by step. The boy's shy smile grew wider each time he saw a project come together, realizing that he could build things too. The boys began looking forward to these nights in the garage, where it was just them, their dad, and the smell of wood and varnish. It became a sanctuary, a place where they felt free to make mistakes, to laugh, and to learn without judgment. With every project, Mark saw the boys' confidence grow, a spark of pride igniting in their eyes as they saw what they could create. One evening, Mark proposed a new project, a small bookshelf for their room. "We'll do it together, from start to finish," he said. "Every piece, every nail, it'll all be something you can say you made." Tom's eyes shone with excitement, and Ben and Leo exchanged eager looks, already envisioning what the shelf might look like. For hours, they measured, cut, sanded, and assembled, working side by side with Mark's patient guidance. Mistakes happened. A few planks had to be redone, but they persisted, each boy finding his own role in the process. Leo held the nails steady as Ben hammered, and Tom made sure every piece was level. When they finally finished, they stepped back to admire their work, a sturdy, neatly varnished bookshelf, crafted with care and filled with small imperfections that made it uniquely theirs. As they stood there, covered in sawdust but grinning from ear to ear, Mark looked down at his sons, his heart swelling with pride. "You did this," he said softly. "All of you, and that's what I want you to remember. No matter what anyone else says or thinks, you've got the strength to make something of your own. Just like this bookshelf, you're building something special every day." Tom nodded, understanding the deeper meaning behind Mark's words. "It's ours," he said quietly, a sense of ownership and pride shining in his eyes. That night, as they placed the bookshelf in their room and filled it with their favorite books and toys, the boys felt a new sense of belonging. A feeling that together they could create their own path, their own family, regardless of the challenges they faced. The garage became their haven, a place where they could be themselves, where they could dream, build, and learn, bound together by the strength of their love and the quiet resilience Mark had taught them. And in those quiet nights, as they worked side by side in the warm glow of the garage, their laughter mixing with the sound of chisels and sandpaper, they became not just a family, but a team, facing the world together, one project at a time. The annual town fair was an event that Mark and his family always looked forward to. With food stalls, games, and live music, it was usually the perfect day to relax and have fun. This year, though, as he gathered the boys to attend, Mark sensed a tinge of hesitation from them. The fair meant facing the town, and the town had not been kind. But Mark, with his ever-steady presence, knelt in front of his boys and offered a gentle smile. "Listen," he said, meeting each of their eyes. "Today's for us, not for anyone else, okay? We're going to have a good time, no matter what. And remember, family means we stand together. We face things together." Leo, the youngest, nodded resolutely, finding strength in Mark's confidence. Tom and Ben glanced at each other, sharing a look of determination before following their father's lead. Together, they walked toward the fair, each boy clinging to the promise that, whatever happened, they were a team. At the entrance to the fairgrounds, Mark paid for their tickets, and the boys' faces lit up as the sounds of the fair washed over them. The cheerful music, the laughter, the distant shouts from the rides. But as they moved through the crowd, they quickly noticed people giving them sideways glances, some whispering to one another with a mix of disapproval and disbelief. Mark kept his head high, refusing to let the town's reactions ruin their day. "Come on, let's start with the ring toss," he said cheerfully, nudging them forward. The boys nodded, clinging to his upbeat tone as they walked up to the booth. Each took turns tossing rings, laughing as they missed or cheered when one made it onto a peg. But soon, as they moved through different games and activities, the murmurs became harder to ignore. One man at a food stand whispered loud enough for Mark to hear, "It's a disgrace, really. What's he trying to prove?" Another woman, standing with her friends by a booth, looked them over disapprovingly before muttering, "Those poor kids, they don't belong with him." Mark saw the boys' faces fall slightly, their shoulders tensing as they picked up on the cruel words. He gently placed a hand on Tom's shoulder, squeezing reassuringly. "You remember what we talked about, right?" he whispered, leaning close so the boys could hear him. "They don't get to decide who we are. We do. And today, we're here to enjoy ourselves, no matter what." Tom looked up at him, his eyes a mix of gratitude and courage. With a slight nod, he glanced at his brothers, who took a breath and steadied themselves. They moved toward the Ferris wheel, determined to push through the discomfort and make the day a happy memory. Mark bought tickets for all of them, and as they boarded the ride, the boys' spirits lifted, enchanted by the view and the sensation of floating above the fairgrounds. As they climbed higher, the laughter of the crowd below became a distant hum, and for those few minutes, it was just the four of them in their own world. Mark pointed out the fields and the river beyond, explaining little bits of history and stories he'd learned over the years. The boys listened intently, momentarily freed from the judgment they'd faced below. When the ride ended, they stepped off with a bit more confidence, ready to continue exploring. Mark led them to a booth with hand-carved trinkets, explaining the craftsmanship and showing them how similar it was to the woodworking they'd done together. The boys marveled at the tiny carvings, each one a reminder of their own skills and creativity. Yet, as they strolled further, a small group of boys from school approached them. The ringleader, a tall kid with a smirk, sneered at Tom, Ben, and Leo. "So, is he your dad now?" he taunted, snickering. "Do you guys even look like a family?" Mark quickly stepped between his sons and the group, his voice calm but firm. "We are a family," he said, his tone leaving no room for argument. "And families stick together." The boys glanced nervously at their father, finding strength in his protective stance. Leo, with a defiant tilt of his chin, said, "Yeah, he's our dad, and we're here to have fun." The taunting kids fell silent, taken aback by the unwavering confidence of the little boy. Mark smiled proudly, ruffling Leo's hair before leading them away from the group. As they walked toward the food stands, Tom spoke up, his voice quiet but certain. "You're right, Mark. They don't get to decide who we are. We do." The boys spent the rest of the day trying new foods, laughing at the funny hats in a souvenir stall, and tossing balls at a shooting game booth. Mark made sure to keep the focus on their time together, and slowly but surely, the whispers of the crowd became just background noise, drowned out by the laughter and shared joy they found in each other. By the time the sun began to set, the boys' pockets were stuffed with little prizes, their faces flushed with excitement and contentment. As they walked back to the truck, each one carried a different prize: a stuffed animal, a plastic sheriff's badge, a small carved pendant. Small symbols of a day they had claimed as their own, in spite of everything. As they piled into the truck, exhausted but happy, Mark glanced back at them, his heart swelling with pride. "Remember this," he said quietly, his voice full of warmth. "Remember that today, we stood together. That's what matters, boys. No matter what anyone else thinks or says, we're a family, and no one can take that from us." The boys nodded, understanding the depth of his words. And as the truck pulled away from the fairgrounds, they each felt a little stronger, a little braver. For they had faced the town's scorn together, holding on to each other, and refusing to let anyone tear them down. And as they drove home, the boys knew that, in their father's love and their shared resilience, they had found a strength no words could break. The next chapter of Mark's journey with the boys unfolded as they began volunteering around town. It had been Mark's idea to get involved with community service, hoping it would not only help them build stronger bonds, but also show the townspeople a different side of his family, a side of kindness, hard work, and resilience that no one could ignore. Their first project was at the local library, where Mrs. Willow, the elderly librarian known for her sharp gaze and strict rules, oversaw all activities. Mark and the boys showed up on a chilly Saturday morning, sleeves rolled up and ready to work. Mrs. Willow looked them over as if she were assessing each one, her expression unreadable. Mark offered a polite nod, and the boys followed suit, trying to hide their nerves. "Well," Mrs. Willow finally said with a small, approving nod, "I suppose I could use the help." We're reorganizing the children's section today." She handed each boy a stack of books, explaining how they should be arranged. The boys listened intently, eager to prove themselves. Leo, fascinated by all the colors and pictures, immediately got to work, carefully placing each book exactly as Mrs. Willow had shown him. Tom and Ben worked together, their hands moving quickly as they set up new displays and tidied the shelves. As the morning went on, other library goers noticed them. A few parents watched from a distance, whispering among themselves, but there was less judgment in their eyes this time. Instead, they seemed curious, surprised to see the boys working so diligently. One parent even leaned over to another and murmured, "They're polite kids, aren't they?" By the end of the day, the children's section was immaculate. Mrs. Willow, who had been observing quietly, called the boys over and offered a rare smile. "You did a fine job today. I think the children who come here will really enjoy it. Thank you." The boys grinned proudly, and Mark felt a warmth in his heart, knowing that this was a small step forward. Mrs. Willow's approval was just the beginning. Next, they volunteered at the food bank, where Mark and the boys spent hours organizing boxes and loading bags for families in need. The atmosphere there was different. People were less guarded and more open, grateful for every extra set of hands. The boys worked alongside other volunteers, and as they did, they met individuals who treated them with kindness and respect, offering encouraging words. One of the other volunteers, a woman named Linda, noticed Leo struggling to lift a heavy box. She smiled and gave him a hand. "Here, sweetie, let me help you. You're a hard worker, aren't you?" Leo nodded, his eyes shining with pride. It was the first time someone outside their family had praised him, and he felt a surge of confidence. Linda winked at him, saying, "With boys like you around, this town's going to be in good hands." As word spread of their volunteer efforts, more people began to notice the boys' good-heartedness and dedication. At each event, more townspeople were willing to lend a friendly smile or exchange a kind word, softening their once harsh views. When they returned to the library, Mrs. Leibachsev, Willow welcomed them warmly, even bringing cookies as a thank you treat. At the food bank, they were greeted with familiarity, the staff happy to have their help. One afternoon, as they were wrapping up a shift, Mrs. Willow approached Mark and the boys, her face softer than they'd ever seen it. "I want you to know," she said, her voice gentle, "you boys are making a difference here. People are noticing." Tom, who had once hesitated to look anyone in the eye, glanced up and smiled. "Thank you, Mrs. Willow. We're happy to help." Gradually, other townsfolk like Mrs. Willow began to open up. One by one, they saw the boys for who they truly were: kind, hardworking, and resilient. At the next town council meeting, one of the parents spoke up, sharing a story about how Tom had gone out of his way to help carry groceries for an elderly woman. Another mentioned how Ben had organized a mini cleanup with his brothers after the library project, tidying up a small park by themselves. Slowly, the tide was turning. The community saw that Mark's family wasn't defined by appearances or gossip, but by their actions and the kindness they extended to others. Mark watched with pride as his boys earned the respect of the very people who had once scorned them, their small wins growing with each project. By the time they finished their latest round of volunteering, the boys were no longer met with cold stares or whispers. Instead, people greeted them with nods, smiles, and even the occasional thank you. At the food bank, one of the staff members pulled Mark aside and handed him a small bouquet of flowers. "For the boys," she said, smiling warmly. "They're a credit to this town." Mark's heart swelled as he accepted the flowers, knowing they represented something far bigger than just gratitude. They were a symbol of acceptance, of the community's slow but steady change of heart. And as he watched his boys share a laugh with Mrs. Willow over a new stack of books at the library, he knew they were finally being seen for who they truly were: a family bound by love, courage, and the unbreakable bond they had forged in the face of adversity. As the days grew warmer, the town's newfound sense of unity was put to the test. A massive storm, one of the worst in recent history, rolled in with a fierce and relentless power. The wind howled through the streets, tearing off roofs, shattering windows, and uprooting trees. When the storm finally passed, the town was left in chaos, streets flooded, homes destroyed, and lives upended. Mark's house, though sturdy, had sustained considerable damage, with fallen branches crushing part of the roof and windows shattered by debris. The morning after the storm, Mark stood in the wreckage of his home, surveying the damage. The boys were beside him, their faces pale but resolute. The storm had thrown their world into disarray. But Mark knew that in moments like these, it was their actions, not their circumstances, that defined them. He turned to his sons and said, "This is a chance for us to help our neighbors, to show what we're made of. We can rebuild, and we'll do it together." Without hesitation, the boys grabbed their tools and began clearing debris from the yard. Mark quickly made a plan to go around the neighborhood, seeing who needed help the most. They started with Mr. Harris, an elderly man whose roof had collapsed completely. The old man had no family in town, and his neighbors had already begun to rally around him. "Come on, boys," Mark said, as they loaded up their truck with plywood and tarps. "Let's give him a hand." Together, they spent the day working under the hot sun, sawing wood, hammering nails, and patching up the roof. The boys, though still young, had learned much from Mark's woodworking skills, and their hands worked quickly and efficiently. They were a team, their bond stronger than ever, as they labored side by side. Leo and Tom climbed onto ladders, steadying the beams, while Ben worked on clearing the debris from the yard. As they worked, more people from the town came by. At first, it was just a few curious onlookers, residents who had grown accustomed to avoiding Mark and his boys. But as they watched the family working with such determination and care, something began to shift. One by one, the townspeople began to join in. Mrs. Willow, who had been reluctant to interact with them at first, appeared with a large cooler of iced tea for the workers. She smiled as she handed it to Mark, saying, "I didn't realize how much you all could do." With every small act of kindness, with every nail hammered into place, Mark could feel the tide turning. Neighbors began to come together, helping each other as they had never done before. And as more people worked alongside Mark and his boys, they began to see the strength of the family and the values Mark had instilled in them, values of resilience, compassion, and community. By the time the afternoon sun began to set, the roof was patched, and Mr. Harris was standing outside, his eyes moist with gratitude. "I didn't think anyone would come to help me," he said, shaking Mark's hand. "Thank you. You've done more than just fix my roof. You've given me hope." Mark smiled, his heart swelling with pride. He turned to his sons. "This is what it's all about, guys. We may not be able to change the past, but we can change how we face the future. And as long as we stand together, nothing can stop us." The storm had tested them, but in the face of disaster, Mark and his children had proven that resilience was their true strength. The damage to their own home didn't matter, not when there was so much work to be done, so many lives to touch. As they finished their day, Mark looked around the neighborhood, seeing how the community had come together, all of them sharing the same goal: to rebuild, to heal, and to move forward. In the days that followed, the town's perspective shifted even further. No longer seen as outsiders or different, Mark and his boys had become a symbol of perseverance. People who had once kept their distance now sought them out for help and guidance. Word of their selflessness spread through town, with each act of kindness and every home they helped rebuild, bringing them closer to being accepted. Even in the face of the storm's devastation, Mark's family had found a way to make something beautiful out of the chaos. They had not only rebuilt homes, they had rebuilt relationships, trust, and a sense of belonging. And through it all, the children who had once felt abandoned and out of place had learned the power of community and the true meaning of family. As the weeks passed, Mark and his boys continued to pour their hearts into the community. They volunteered at the food bank, helped clean up local parks, and assisted with repairs to homes and businesses that had been damaged by the storm. The people who had once avoided them, those who had whispered behind their backs and cast judgment on their family, began to notice something different. It wasn't just the way Mark and his sons worked tirelessly, never asking for anything in return. It was how they treated others, with respect, kindness, and an unwavering dedication to making their town a better place. In their eyes, the children weren't just adopted sons. They were valuable members of the community who had endured much and still found the strength to give back. Slowly, Piece by piece, the cold walls of suspicion began to crack. Then, one warm afternoon, a community gathering was planned in the town square. It wasn't a grand affair, just a simple potluck, a way for people to come together, share a meal, and talk about the changes they had experienced since the storm. Mark and the boys had planned to attend, but they had no expectations of being treated any differently. Still, as they arrived, they felt the weight of their past encounters, the stares, the whispers, the unspoken tension. But this time was different. As Mark and his sons walked into the square, they were met with an unexpected silence. It wasn't the usual cold shoulder or hushed gossip. Instead, a few of the townspeople stepped forward, including Mrs. Willow, who had become one of the most outspoken supporters of Mark's family. She looked at Mark with a warm, apologetic smile. "Mark," she said, her voice steady but filled with emotion, "I owe you an apology. I've been wrong about a lot of things, and about you especially. I've seen how hard you've worked for this town and how you've raised your boys with love and kindness. I've seen how they've become a part of this community, not because of their past, but because of their hearts. I'm sorry for judging you." Her words were followed by several others, people who had once been among the harshest critics of Mark and his children. One by one, they stepped forward, some hesitant, others with open sincerity. A neighbor named Tom Harris, whose house Mark had helped repair, stood beside Mrs. Willow, his voice gruff but full of gratitude. "I didn't understand it at first," Tom said. "I didn't know why you took those kids in, Mark. I didn't understand what you were doing, but after seeing what you've done for this town, I can see now. You're not just taking care of those kids. You're showing us all what family really means. I'm sorry for ever doubting you." As the apologies came, Mark looked at his boys, his heart swelling with pride. They stood tall, their eyes reflecting a mixture of surprise and deep, deep appreciation. Tom, Ben, and Leo had come so far, from being the children who were whispered about to being the young men who had earned the respect of a community. Mark felt a lump in his throat, but he held it together. He wasn't one for speeches, but he knew this moment was important. It was a turning point, not just for him and his sons, but for the entire town. He stepped forward, nodding to those who had spoken, before addressing the crowd. "I've always believed that a community is only as strong as its willingness to stand together. When I brought these boys into my life, I knew it wouldn't be easy. But we did it because we believed in the goodness of people. And I've seen that goodness here today. It's not about where we come from or what we've been through. It's about who we choose to be now and how we lift each other up." There was a long pause before the crowd erupted into applause. The warm sound of clapping spread through the air, and for the first time, Mark could feel the weight of the years of judgment lifting. It wasn't just the acknowledgement of his family that had shifted. It was the beginning of a true change in the town's heart. That evening, Mark and his boys stayed at the gathering, joining in the laughter and conversation. It was a quiet but powerful moment. They weren't just tolerated anymore. They were embraced, seen for who they were, rather than where they had come from. And as the sun set over the town, Mark couldn't help but think about how far they had come. From the whispers in the street to a standing ovation of acceptance and understanding. As they headed home, Mark wrapped his arm around Tom's shoulders. "This is what it's all about," he said softly. "We've built something that can't be torn down. Not by anyone, not by any storm. We're stronger because we did it together." The boys smiled, their eyes bright with a newfound confidence. They had faced the worst of the world, but in the end, they had changed it too. They had changed not just the way the town saw them, but the way they saw themselves. And with each new day, they knew they would continue to be a family, forever bound by the strength of their love and the resilience they had built together. The days following the community gathering were filled with an overwhelming sense of change. The once cold town, whose streets had echoed with whispers and judgment, now felt warmer, more open. The small yet profound acts of kindness from Mark and his boys were making waves that spread through every corner of the community. It wasn't long before the more prominent figures in the town began to realize the significance of what was happening. People like Mrs. Aldridge, a local businesswoman whose initial reaction to Mark's family had been one of disdain, started to recognize the deeper truth that was now unfolding in front of them. Mrs. Aldridge, known for her sharp tongue and even sharper opinions, had been one of the loudest critics when Mark had first adopted the boys. But now, her gaze had softened, and she had begun to see beyond her preconceived notions. One crisp morning, as Mark and the boys were walking through the town square, they noticed a small crowd gathering near the town hall. It was an unusual sight, and as they drew closer, they saw familiar faces, people who had once avoided eye contact, who had once turned their backs on them. Among them was Mrs. Aldridge, standing with the mayor, her head slightly bowed in what looked like deep reflection. As Mark and the boys approached, the mayor, a tall man with silver hair, stepped forward. He raised a hand to quiet the crowd, and with a solemn expression, he addressed the gathering. "Ladies and gentlemen," the mayor began, his voice resonating with authority, but also with sincerity. "Today, we come together not just as a town, but as a community that has learned something very important. We've learned that unity is not just a word, it's an action. It's about standing together, even when it's hard. And sometimes, it's about admitting when we've been wrong." He paused, glancing over at Mark and his sons. "Mark, Tom, Ben, Leo, today we publicly acknowledge the contributions you've made to this town, the strength you've shown, the kindness you've extended, and the way you've inspired each of us to reconsider our judgments. We are better because of you." The crowd was still, the weight of the words hanging in the air. Mrs. Aldridge stepped forward next, her eyes meeting Mark's with a rare vulnerability. Her voice, usually so firm, quivered slightly as she spoke. "I want to publicly apologize," she said, her tone unwavering but filled with regret. "I was wrong. I judged you, Mark, and I judged your children. I failed to see the love and strength you all shared, and for that, I am deeply sorry. I can only hope that we can move forward as a community with open hearts." Mark could feel the weight of her words, the genuine remorse in her voice. He nodded slowly, his own emotions rising within him. The boys, standing beside him, looked at Mrs. Aldridge with a mixture of surprise and quiet understanding. They had been through so much, but moments like this, moments of true accountability, had the power to heal old wounds. Before Mark could speak, the mayor continued. "To honor Mark and his family's contributions, we are here today to present a formal recognition. This ceremony is not just about acknowledging their hard work, but about acknowledging the change they've sparked in all of us. The spirit of unity and compassion that Mark's family has shown should be a model for all of us. We've been given a second chance to grow, to become better, and to build a town that is stronger and more inclusive than ever before." The mayor gestured to the town's council members, who had prepared a plaque. It was a simple wooden plaque engraved with the words "For strength, unity, and compassion," honoring Mark, Tom, Ben, and Leo, a family that changed us all. As the mayor handed the plaque to Mark, the crowd erupted into applause. It wasn't a mere polite gesture. It was a heartfelt recognition. People who had once avoided Mark and his sons were now standing together, applauding not just their hard work, but their resilience, their courage to face adversity, and their unwavering love for one another. Mark felt a lump form in his throat as he accepted the plaque. He looked at his boys, who stood beside him with smiles that reached their eyes. This was more than a ceremony. It was the culmination of everything they had worked for. It was a moment of validation, not just for him as a father, but for the family they had become, the bond they had forged despite the trials they'd faced. I don't know what to say," Mark began, his voice thick with emotion. "I never expected this. I didn't do any of this for recognition or praise. I did it because it was the right thing to do. But what matters most to me, what truly matters, is that my boys, my family, are seen for who they are. And I'm grateful to this town for seeing us." The applause grew louder, and Mark felt a deep sense of peace wash over him. This moment was the culmination of a long journey, but it wasn't just a victory for him and his family. It was a victory for the entire town, a victory for understanding, compassion, and the power of change. As the ceremony ended, the crowd slowly began to disperse, but the mood had shifted completely. People gathered in smaller groups, chatting and laughing, sharing stories of how they had been affected by Mark and his sons. It was as if a heavy veil had been lifted, and a new chapter in the town's history had begun. Mark, his sons, and the people of the town had learned something that day, a lesson about the strength it takes to change hearts and minds and the power of unity in the face of adversity. And as they walked back home, Mark knew that this was just the beginning of a new, brighter future for all of them. 10 years had passed since that pivotal day at the ceremony. The town, once divided by prejudice and suspicion, had transformed into a place of understanding, where the walls that once separated its people had slowly crumbled away. And at the heart of this transformation was Mark's family, now a symbol of resilience, compassion, and unity. Mark stood at the edge of the town square, watching as his 3 sons, now young men, worked together at a community event. Tom, Ben, and Leo had grown into individuals who not only embraced their father's values, but had expanded upon them, each finding their own path to success. They had faced their challenges, but with every obstacle, they had grown stronger and more determined to contribute to the town that had once rejected them. Tom, the eldest, had become a respected engineer. His expertise in sustainable building had made him a go-to figure in town for both residential and community projects. He often worked alongside Mark, using their shared passion for craftsmanship to improve the homes and infrastructure of the town. His innovative ideas had led to the construction of new, eco-friendly homes and buildings that had garnered admiration far beyond the town's borders. More importantly, Tom had become a mentor to many young people in the town, offering them the same opportunities that had been afforded to him. Ben, the second son, had become a teacher. He was passionate about education and had dedicated his life to working with children who, like him, had once struggled with loss and uncertainty. His classroom was a sanctuary for students who needed more than just academic lessons. They needed someone who understood them, who could guide them with patience and empathy. Ben's influence reached far beyond the walls of the school. He had started after-school programs, created youth outreach initiatives, and worked tirelessly to bridge gaps between the generations. His commitment to the town's youth had made him a beloved figure in the community. Leo, the youngest, had followed his father's love of woodworking. He had turned that passion into a thriving business, restoring old furniture and creating intricate custom pieces that were in high demand. But Leo's contributions went beyond just craftsmanship. He had founded a nonprofit that provided woodworking classes to at-risk youth. He knew firsthand how learning a craft could give a person a sense of pride and purpose, and he wanted to share that gift with others. His workshops became a haven for young people who, like him, needed a safe space to express their creativity and build their confidence. Mark watched as his sons worked side by side with other members of the community, laughing and sharing stories as they rebuilt the town's historic library. It was a testament to how far they had all come. His eyes filled with pride as he saw the fruit of the values he had instilled in them: hard work, compassion, resilience, and the unwavering belief in the power of family. As the day wore on, Mark sat down on the old bench near the town square, where he often came to reflect on how much had changed. He thought back to the early days when he and the boys had faced rejection, when the weight of the world had seemed too heavy to bear. The long nights of silence and fear had eventually given way to laughter, to shared meals, to the joy of seeing his sons grow into young men of integrity and kindness. And yet, even as he watched the town and his family thrive, Mark knew that this journey had never been just about him or his sons. It had been about something much bigger. A legacy that would continue to ripple through the generations. A legacy that proved that one family's courage to love, to forgive, and to build a future together could change not just their lives, but an entire community. The townspeople who had once shunned Mark and his sons now sought their advice, their counsel, their friendship. The prejudice that had once plagued their lives had given way to respect and admiration. The same people who had whispered in the streets were now the ones who volunteered alongside Mark and his sons, giving back to the community that had given them so much. Mark smiled as he watched his boys, no longer boys, but men, carry on the work they had started. They weren't just building houses or teaching classes or creating businesses. They were building a town that had learned the value of unity, the power of family, and the importance of accepting others for who they truly were. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting a warm glow over the town, Mark felt a deep sense of fulfillment. He had done what he set out to do. He had created a family. He had built a home. And he had helped to heal a community. The work wasn't finished, but the foundation had been laid. His sons were carrying the torch forward, and he knew they would continue to light the way for others. The legacy of love and acceptance would live on, not just in Mark's heart, but in the hearts of the people he had touched. And as he looked at his sons, strong, compassionate, and proud, he realized that the most powerful thing they had built was not the houses, the businesses, or the programs. It was the spirit of togetherness that now defined their town, a spirit that would continue to grow long after the sun had set on another day. Mark's work was done, but the impact of his family's love would echo through the town for generations to come. And that, he knew, was the greatest legacy of all. 10 years later, Mark stands proudly as he watches his sons, now grown and successful, continue to make a lasting impact on the community. Tom, Ben, and Leo have not only carried on their father's legacy, but have also helped heal old prejudices, embodying the true spirit of family, love, and acceptance. They've turned a town once divided by judgment into one united by compassion and understanding. If you were moved by this story and want to see more inspiring tales like this, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, like the video, and leave a comment sharing your thoughts. We'd love to hear your story and help spread the message of love, unity, and positive change. Join us in making the world a better place, one story at a time.